Guys, it's Josh from Throwing Athletes Forum here, and I've got Chris Ackland. Is that how you say it?
Ackland,
yeah. Ackland,
yeah.
sorry.
You've got to be more aggressive.
Yeah, yeah. And we're here to talk to you guys basically about youth development and where does Olympic lifting fit in? What years can you do it? How is that going to play into your throwing? And we're just going to keep it nice and simple for you guys. So, Chris, we'll start off with when is it okay to start Olympic lifting?
Well, I think the sooner the better. Like I've got a 15-year-old girl now she's been doing it for 2 years, and she came from a CrossFit background, so she had an idea of technique. Her technique was really good, and I see her once a week, and we focus on, or sometimes once a fortnight, we focus on technique. But that has to be the key factor. We don't rush weights. The movement has to be key. It has to complement whatever you're doing, whether it's throws, whether it's playing football. But the earlier you get to get your hands on that bar, the better it's going to be for your long-term development. Because if I have to teach you at 18 years old or 22 years old versus you've already got 4, 5, 6 years experience, it can make a huge difference.
And if the bar is intimidating or scary, there's other implements that you probably use.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like we've got like multiple different weight barbells. I've got 5 kilo, 10 kilo, 15, 20 kilos. If I, let's say for example, I'm teaching, my old man has bad wrists, he's got arthritis in both his wrists, I get him doing med ball cleans, I get him doing dumbbell cleans, I get him doing things that are going to create the same hip extension or the same movement, and I'll use those to start to bridge the gap between it. And sometimes I'll give someone a barbell and it just feels too foreign for them, and we'll go back down to a med ball, we'll get that hip extension, that shrug right, and then we'll start to go to a bar.
Awesome. And in your experience, especially with dealing with people with speed development and force development through the hips, which is, guys, for throwers is massive. We do a lot of medicine ball work. What's sort of the couple of really easy things to look out for simple technique?
Well, so if when I'm teaching Olympic lifters, for example, the easiest cue I've got is jump, because everyone knows how to jump to some extent. So we're looking for like a really good knee and a hip extension. The common mistakes we'll see is like we'll either do only hip extension and there's not enough knee, or we might be missing the ankles. Ideally it's going to be all three, but if I get 2 out of 3 being knees and hips, that's going to be half, or like 90% of where the damage is going to come from, or the force is going to come from. So like when I first teach someone, I might get them holding the barbell and literally just get them to jump.
Awesome.
The way I tend to coach technique, and every coach has a different view of what the technique should look like. I want them to finish pretty straight, because if they finish pretty straight with a slight lean back, I'm going to get a lot of ankle, knee, and hip extension, which is going to really mimic a jump, which is going to mimic your throws, which is going to mimic a lot of other athletic movements.
Yeah, and that sort of brings us on to the fact of Olympic lifting, medicine ball, rate of force development through the hips. How is that going to progress your throwing? So why do we do it?
Well, it's one of those things that, like, first and foremost, like weightlifting or being in the gym isn't necessarily the sport, so it has to be something that's going to assist your sport. So first and foremost, obviously, technical prowess is going to be huge for throws. If you can't necessarily throw that well, more time should be spent on that, as you would know. But then as we start to get stronger, as we start being able to produce more force, it's going to help us. There's a common misconception that being strong is all you need to be, and I could give you I don't have the speed, the speedometers or whatever you want to call them, but let's say I have a guy who can bench 400 pounds. I'm going to use this example because it's literally out of a book that I was reading the other day. That's why it's pounds. Let's say I got a bencher who can bench 400 pounds, but it takes him 3 or 4 seconds to overcome that, and then his 1RM is 700 pounds or 600 pounds versus a guy who he benches 400 pounds in 2 seconds and his 1RM's 450. Well, I know that guy with a smaller bench press who can produce force faster at that weight is probably going to throw further, possibly jump further, things of that nature. So it's not necessarily about overcoming the weight, it's about overcoming the weight with like speed or power and things like that.
Yeah, and that's one of the big things that I think as a throws coach, and even for athletes and a thrower and a coach myself, is that we're trying to be more powerful. And I think one of the big things with that is we see a lot of people are they doing it with intent? And I think that's a big thing that you see.
Yeah.
Is if you were to push a wall, is the wall going to push you, or are you just going to stand there? And I think one of the simple things that I do as a coach is I get people to push a wall. What does that feel like? What does tension feel like? What does power feel like? And that's one thing not a lot of people know what it feels like. Is it political power or what sort of power is it? So I think from that standpoint, adding a little weight, even if it's a simple medicine ball or a sandbag or a dumbbell,
Yep.
is probably going to have some sort of understanding on the body of how to actually produce power. And knowing that from the Throwing Athletes Forum is probably a huge tip for you guys, is that what does that feel like? And I had a post yesterday on what does that feel like? You know, what does that feel like in the ring when you're throwing, and what does that feel like when you're lifting? And the next question I got for you is, what's a simple sort of thing, like we talk about planks.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's 50 different ways to do a plank. Is it right? Is it not right? But what would be your thing, even with a bar, is what's power? Like, what's power to you? What's power to a lifter? Like, what would you say to a lifter is sort of the big thing to what they want to feel, or give them suggestions?
Yep. Well, power to me, firstly, is your ability to express strength in a short period of time. And like I've got examples of lifters I've got a guy who's best front squats 125 kilos and can clean 125 kilos. And then I've got examples of guys that can clean front squat 160 kilos and only clean 130. So I know, for example, that guy that produces, you know, more power, every time I get him stronger, as long as we're doing it properly, his weights and his power is going to continue to increase. And I've got other lifters who, you know, I fall into this category who are stronger than I am fast, whereas if I boost my front squat to 165, but I'm not continuing to work explosive and work on that tension that you're talking about, my clean's not going to budge at all. So a couple of different ways I suppose I teach that tension is, firstly, I've got to teach you what landing is. And like if we're talking power clean, a bit more so than power snatch, I think of power as your ability to also absorb that force.
Oh, big time.
So like
Big time.
I've got people who, they might be able to power clean 120, 130 kilos, but as they catch it pushes them down. So they don't necessarily have enough eccentric strength to resist that weight. So it's one thing to be able to produce force, it's another to be able to control it at the same time.
And that brings us on, I'll interrupt you there, because I got asked a couple questions about hammer throw and discus and shot put, and one of the big things is you go from a starting position and you're in single support and you land. Okay, well, how do you react out of the landing? And that's a prime example right there is, can you land and then be quick out of that landing? And can you land and then be explosive? And that's where, you know, old school plyometrics and just simple hops, jumps allow you to have that sort of experience at that level. But now that we've sort of gone through, you know, what is power, what is tension, and how it all relates, and youth development, are we doing it all the time? So are we training explosiveness all the time? And one of the big things that I was asked early on is, what is periodization? You know, so we're kind of going from a general to a specific as the season goes on, and then we're tapering into a competition. And where would you sort of put explosiveness, or would you sort of train it all the way through? I know some examples are doing like a strength day on a Monday or a power day on a Tuesday, depending on how many days you can actually lift. What's sort of your philosophy on that?
Well, it always depends on where the athlete's coming from. So if I've got an athlete who, for example, has enough muscle mass for whatever their goal is, then I'm going to start to look to get that muscle stronger. So we're going to work on strength. I like to work on strength and power in the same thing. As a weightlifter, we're kind of working on it all the time when we have our heavy and our light days. So, for example, we do it a little differently. I like to do it a little differently with regards to, if it was an Olympic lifter, I like them to do their jumps at the end of the session.
Okay.
And I know traditionally speaking, it's supposed to be you do your fastest and then you get to your slowest. But I start the movement with a snatch or a power clean or something that is already generally relatively fast. I like to finish the session fast too. So let's say I finish with my squats and I've done sets of 4 or 5, whatever it is. I personally like for my male lifters to do jumps and things like that. But like in terms of like periodization, things like that, if the athlete has enough muscle mass and their technique's really, really good, I like to start working on rate of force development during their strength phase, and then in their peaking phase is where it really starts to go off. So like let's say a strength phase is going to have the main lifts once to twice a week, probably twice a week. Those lifts are going to look like one day is going to be heavy and one day is going to, or let's say 85-ish%, and then the other day is going to be in the 75 to 80%, working on a bit more speed and power. Now just keep in mind when I'm talking 75 to 80% working on speed and power, they've probably already been training for 6 weeks. So their 75% is no longer 75%, it's probably lower, and that's where it becomes power work. I think a lot of the times people can get confused and like, I'm just trying to get explosive, and I used to do this as well. Like I used to be like, oh, if I can power snatch 80 kilos for the day, even though it's probably just a power snatch, then I'm going to get more powerful. Whereas if I can move 70 kilos with more force, more newtons, more things like that, then I can 80 kilos. 70 kilos is going to do better for that day. So in the scheme of like a week of things, you just want to have it so that you've got you're not. It's one of those things. You can only really train as much as you can recover from.
Yeah.
So like,
and that is a key point.
100%.
That is that point right there. You know, you guys all have lives. You guys are all working. You guys are all just trying to survive and do what you do. And then on top of that, you're trying to throw, you're trying to train, and you're trying to recover. And I think that's the one big key is that, you know, I read an article this morning is, are we training enough or aren't we training enough? And I think the biggest thing is what you just said. That honestly is the quote of the day or the quote of the session here, is that train as much as you can recover. And I'll let you keep going, but man, that's an awesome quote.
It's something that's I'll use one of my girls for example. She came to me with a gymnastics background, so super explosive, flexible. The only things I really need to get for her is stronger, maybe a little bit more muscle mass. We were training 3 days a week. We were seeing fantastic gains. She's a very, very tough job. She's an arborist. She, you know, very physical job. We bumped it up for 4 days, and the progress slowed a little bit, but we thought, you know, maybe that's just her body adapting to it. I think at one stage we trained 5 days, and it was probably the slowest progress that we'd seen. When we went back to training 3 days a week, we went back to progressing really well. She wasn't like things that were like kind of stressful became more stressful.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like trying to fit training in, and because we've got finished late time, so you need to figure out what works best for you, and this is something that comes with a really good coach-athlete relationship, and you learning to listen to your body. But I've seen, I mean, even one of my guys, he trains 3 days a week, and before he saw me, he was stuck on a 90-kilo snatch for 2 years. We got him in the next 18 months, he went from 90 to 112 kilos, and he was training 3 days a week, specific Olympic lifting. So it's just all, it's finding what works for you, and it's like the, what's the thing? It's your body's a sponge, right? And once it's full and you cannot stress it anymore, you cannot soak up any more water. You cannot soak up any more information to adapt from. If anything, it's probably going to start to go backwards and create more of a mess.
Yeah, big time. And you know, prime example of that is I've probably been a bad person for this in myself. Is that, you know, you get to that point where you're like, oh my God, I got to get to that competition. I've got to perform. I've got to, you know, be the best I can. And sometimes that, you know, that sort of recovery and understanding that recovery is probably more beneficial over time. And more in the sense that, from my knowledge, is that, you know, you do a heavy training week. It probably takes 2 to 3 weeks to sort of allow your body to really recover and go through that set. We'll finish off here with what inspires lifters? What's the fun part about it? Because for throwers, guys, you're probably, you know, some are intimidated, some are like, ah, man, there's a bar and I've got to jump and all that sort of stuff. So what's fun about it?
My favorite part about it, and I think a lot of my lifters are very similar, is it's like poultry in motion. When you watch someone that knows how to snatch, when you watch someone that knows how to clean and jerk, it's just, there's something about it. Even from the time they grab an empty barbell, it looks magical, to the time they work their way up to heavy weights. There is something that is just, it's like falling with the process, and that's something I try to put onto a lot of my lifters, is that if you enjoy the process, then training all of a sudden becomes the easy part. And if you focus on the process as opposed to being too like goal oriented, like if I you know, snatch 100 kilos, I'll throw further. Whether it's if it's like drilling, like if I snatch faster, if I'm more explosive, if my catch is stronger, if my hip extension is better, as opposed to the weight that's on the bar. That's the thing that I enjoy. Like right now with Iron Tribe growing and boosting numbers and trying to get more people in, my training's taken a massive hit. I'll be lucky to get 1 to 2 sessions in a week. But that doesn't mean I don't enjoy it any less. I love, you know, the fact that the weakest I've ever been, I can still hit 90% of my best lifts because the technique's still there and the focus is still there. So
yeah, that's awesome, man. Yeah. And that's the big thing with throwers, guys, is take those moments to actually feel the throw, love the feeling of that throw, because, you know, that number on the board is great from time to time, but man, when you hit a solid and it just feels like heaven. Absolutely. Or poetry in motion, those are going to be the lasting effects for you. Huge. Like, you know, I've when I played Graham back in the day, you know, I remember some of the games, and I don't remember half the points, but I remember, man, that hit felt good, or, you know, that catch was amazing, and it was all about that feeling. So we'll finish off with this last thing. Iron Tribe, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, man. Been a pleasure.
They are, so Iron Tribe and Chris here, you know, one of the big things for throwers is if you guys got questions, shoot them through to the Throwing Athletes Forum. We'll pass them along to Chris, especially the weightlifting stuff. And guys, don't be afraid to ask questions, especially about that stuff.
For sure.
There's a lot of gray areas. There's a lot of, you know, sort of completely different opinions on how to do it.
Yep.
But one of the big things is ask the questions, get the answers, and go from there. And as you get that, you'll progress. You know, and that's where it'll go. So thank you so much for joining us, guys. Thank you, Chris. And if you guys got any questions, check out Iron Tribe on Facebook, and we'll go from there.
Thanks,
Cheers.
guys.